According to child labor in factories, today there are 59,600 children that are working in the United States. There are many other countries that have far worse child labor problems. Child labor was at its peak during the Industrial Revolution. The conditions that the children were under were appalling. Children suffered for too long before people helped them. Child labor was one of the darkest parts of America's history and continues to be a problem today. The Industrial Revolution was the time period after the Civil War when America flourished industrially. According to Brenda Stalcup, the Industrial Revolution refers to the change that takes place when a primarily agricultural economy begins to shift to the mechanized manufacturing of goods on a large scale. Few events in history have affected the world as much as the Industrial Revolution. Industries such as petroleum refining and steel manufacturing prospered during this period. People also started using electrical power more frequently, and railroads grew rapidly. The Industrial Revolution created a new class of wealthy entrepreneurs and a comfortable middle class. When the Industrial Revolution first appeared in the United States, factories needed workers desperately. People moved into the cities from the farms to find work. Most of them were frustrated with what they found. Others had led them to believe that the life in the cities was glamorous, when in fact the jobs that were available offered very small wages and required a lot of hours. Because there was such a demand for workers, child labor began to gain popularity. To stay out of poverty, every member of the family had to go to work. Even 3-year-olds were working. The more machines started to replace people and children started to replace adults, the more parents depended on their children. Some families needed the income so much that the parents forced their children to work instead of going to school. By the time child labor in the United States was at its highest point, children worked as newsboys, messengers, and peddlers. They worked in mines, glass factories, and canneries. Disapproval of this child labor was growing in the northern states, which forced most of the factories to move to the south. Every state had different standards for child labor. The conditions of children who were working in the factories were horrendous. Factory owners were very fond of child labor. They claimed that it was good for the economy and that it built the children's character. They favored children because they were more manageable, cheaper to pay, and less likely to strike than adults. Sometimes a child could work up to 19 hours a day with only a 1-hour break. That was very uncommon, but children would often work 12 to 14 hours a day. They worked off the books. In other words, the factories didn't keep track of how many hours the children worked. This meant that the factories didn't pay them for the actual time that they worked. Children working these hard hours, and they weren't paid what they should have been, and sometimes they didn't get paid at all. The children who were paid were only paid a portion of what an adult would earn. Orphans were usually unfairly paid. The factories defended this by saying that they gave them food, shelter, and clothes, but all of these were below standards. Besides the hard hours and the unfair wages, the children worked in very dangerous conditions. The children were using very large, heavy equipment. According to Childhood Loss, the machines ran so fast that it was very easy for a child's fingers or arms to get caught in the equipment. Children were injured or even killed by the machines. It was very common for children who were not big enough to work with the machines to assist textile workers. This wasn't any better than working with the machines because the textile workers were very cruel to the children. They would verbally abuse them and physically beat them. They didn't care about the children's safety at all. The fumes and toxins that the factories made were also hazardous to the children's health, as they could lead to chronic conditions and diseases. Girls and boys were beaten and neglected at work. According to child labor in factories, a common punishment was called weighting. When the children were weighted, a factory worker would tie a heavy weight onto the child's neck. The child would have to walk up and down the aisles of the factory in front of the other children for up to an hour. The other children were supposed to take example. The weighting led to serious back and neck problems. Changing laws concerning child labor was not an easy task, but there were some people who were courageous enough to try. Grace Abbott was one who was inspired to make a difference. She was born in Grand Island, Nebraska, and her mother was a Quaker. Her mother was involved in the Underground Railroad and women's suffrage. Her father was involved in state political issues. Abbott began to carry out the first federal law that restricted child labor, but the Supreme Court struck down the legislation. Grace Abbott later joined the Department of Labor in 1917, and she was assigned to the Children's Bureau. She campaigned for a constitutional amendment to limit child labor. The amendment was never ratified, but it led to the legislation that said that no children under the age of 16 could work. The National Child Labor Committee or NCLC, had goals of challenging child labor. In 1910, a committee established the Uniform Child Labor Law. The NCLC hoped that child labor would be eliminated forever if every state would change its laws. One of the NCLC's most crucial decisions was to hire photographer Louis Hine. He collected information and took pictures as he traveled all over the country. Hine took pictures of what he saw and also wrote about the lives of the children. Hine felt the pain of the children and wanted to end the torture for them. His photographs stunned the country. The NCLC published his pictures and reports in magazines and newspapers. While his photos were being published, 39 states passed laws against child labor, but most of these did not meet the NCLC standards. Hine did what few creative people managed to do: create images of lasting artistic and social value. If people have doubt about the torture that the children endured, they just have to look at the pictures that Hine took. Hine and the NCLC believed that in an industrial and social society, an uneducated child would remain poor forever. Together, they moved public to action to eliminate child labor forever. The NCLC fought states one by one to end child labor. During our time today, we've discussed child labor issues in the United States. We've learned about the Industrial Revolution and talked about the conditions that the children were under and how they were treated, and we've also discussed some of the people who tried to end it. Child labor in the United States was one of the worst parts of the country's history, and it hasn't been completely eliminated. America was supposed to be a safe place for everyone, but it was not safe for the children.